Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on your Saturday. I'm just going to give it a moment to let people load in here, let their computers do the connection making, and then we'll get started. Okay, I can see the loading numbers starting to slow down here, so let's get into it. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2022 Guelph Organic Conference. Thank you for joining us for the Seeds, the Foundation of the Agricultural System session. I'm going to start the session first with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to first acknowledge that the sacred land where the Organic Council of Ontario resides is situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit peoples. Please take a moment to reflect on where you are situated and the history of the lands you now occupy. We welcome you to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat. We encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are in relationship with by visiting Whose Land and nativeland.ca. And there you'll find some links to these sites in the chat. So how to participate in the session. For some of you, this might be your 9th organic conference session, so you know by now, but just in case we have any newcomers, we'd like to invite you all again to share who you are and where you're coming from in the chat. Make sure your chat audience is set to everyone, or your message will just be sent to the panelists. There will be time to ask the speakers questions after their presentations, and there's 2 ways to ask questions. You can write your questions in the Q&A box. You'll see that there's a Q&A option and a chat option. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A box, that just helps us keep them organized and make sure we answer them. You can add questions here throughout the presentation, and then we'll get to them after our speakers are done. You can also raise your hand using the raise hand button, and then after the presentation, we will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question live. And then lastly, we're so fortunate to have these presenters share their knowledge and experience with us, as well as the community of attendees that have joined this session. We just ask that you please communicate respectfully with all participants in the session. So hosting today is the Organic Council of Ontario. OCO is the voice of organics in Ontario, a membership-based nonprofit association that represents Ontario's organic sector. OCO is the only trade association working and advocating on behalf of the entire organic industry from field to plate. Our membership includes all certified organic producers, but supporting members are a main source of our revenues and also receive benefits. If you like the work that we're doing and you believe in a strong local food system, consider becoming a member today. For updates on organic agricultural news, resources, funding opportunities, green jobs, and more, sign up for our e-news on our website, links in the chat. And then the OCO AGM is on March 31st, and we're currently recruiting board members. So there's also a link in the chat for our nomination forms. And then this year's conference theme was inspired by OCO's Organic Climate Solutions campaign. Through this campaign, funded by the Government of Canada's Climate Action and Awareness Fund, we want to raise awareness of the environmental and economic benefits of organic and regenerative farming practices, as well as the resources available to support farmers in taking up these practices. We've set up a whole website with resources, as well as a summary of all the different mentorship and financial supports for farmers looking to take up these practices. So we encourage you to check that out. We'd also like to extend a big thank you to Tomas Nemo for his 40+ years of commitment to the organic sector and his long-standing work on the Guelph Organic Conference. The Guelph Organic Conference has been an important meeting place for the sector over its many years of growth. That's not to say Tomas wasn't still a big part of planning this year's conference. And while OCO is hosting this year's virtual conference, the conference will continue as it has in years past once we are back in person. And then lastly, we'd like to thank our sponsors. The conference is not possible without the support of our sponsors. Thank you to our Grow Level sponsors. And then thank you to our, grow level sponsors, EcoCert and Yorkshire Valley Farms, and our Flourish level sponsors, Fenning Organic Farm, ProCert Organic Systems, Canadian Organic Growers, and the Prairie Development Fund in the Government of Canada. So with that, I will now pass it off to our speakers, who will introduce themselves. Dwayne, if you'd like to take it away. Dwayne, you're just on mute, sorry.
Thank you. That helps a lot, I hope. I'm Dwayne Falk. I basically grew up on a farm. I come from farming background, and therefore I know how much work farming is. And since I liked farming, crops, animals, and genetics, I pursued a academic career to combine those and wound up being a plant breeder. My first real job was in New Zealand, where I worked on malting barley, which was associated with some breweries, so it had some perks. I was then hired to come back to the University of Guelph, where I did my PhD, and I was a cereal breeder at Guelph for 30 years. I worked primarily in spring barley, winter barley, and oats. And then I retired, and I had forgotten how much work farming was, so I bought a farm, and I've been on the farm ever since. I continue to work in breeding through the Mimosa Breeding and Research Group, which is primarily me. I work on spring barley, winter barley, oats, rye, winter peas with the EFAO, and I work on potatoes, partly in cooperation and collaboration with Bauta. I provided some germplasm for a number of organic farmers to do selections on their farms, and the results of that are now being evaluated by AAFC in Fredericton. So I'm hoping for some good results there. I'm going to be talking primarily about potatoes today, but I do have a fairly broad background and might answer some questions on just about anything else. Now, I usually add a qualifier. I blame a lot of things on my mother because she was Dutch. And that explains a lot of the things that I've done in my life. Anyway, I think Rebecca is also going to be talking. Rebecca made a mistake and took an organic course from me more than a few years ago. I think she's recovered by now, I hope. Rebecca?
Thanks, Dwayne. And hello to everyone. It's so nice to see the numbers jumping up in the participant list here. Domarden, Guten Tag. My name is Rebecca Ivanoff, and I'm calling in from this extremely sunny, beautiful day here beside the Yan Dawandore, which is the Wendat name for the Speed River here in Guelph. And I'm speaking with my hat on as the seed program manager for the EFAO, which is the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, where I get to support farmers in learning about regional seed production. And I'll talk to you about those ways when we get to that section of the presentation. And, you know, I think like Dwayne saying, our stories with plants and life takes a winding journey. And I've always had this lifelong curiosity about the plants around me and the connection between plants and culture, plants and people. And because of that, I went and studied anthropology and botany at both the undergrad and graduate levels at the University of Guelph. But I didn't have the background of farming. I had, planted things in the backyard with my mom and my sister and brother, but I wanted to learn more about ecological farming. So I joined Whole Circle Farm as a craft intern in 2013 and stayed on and eventually became co-manager of the 10-acre vegetable CSA. And I also got to work with my mentor, Johan, on reintroducing seed production into our farming system. It was also during this time, because I was making all of these beautiful connections with other seed growers, that I started the Southern Ontario Pepper Breeding Project with 3 other farmers, and we became sort of a little plant breeding club, which I've talked about last year at the Guelph Organic Conference, but we'll mention just briefly when I also get to my section. But that it's these links, with farming and plant breeding and seed saving. And I love how they give us an opportunity to honor the past, the present, and also the future. So perhaps I'll pass it over to you, Aaron.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Verity, and I work with High Mowing Organic Seeds. I am based out here on Whidbey Island in the Salish Sea, just a little bit south of Victoria, BC, on land of the Snohomish people. So I work with High Mowing. I am primarily the commercial grower representative, working with Canadian growers, helping them find the varieties they need, availability questions, shipping, but also just all around technical support for anything on the farm I can provide. And I am mostly qualified to do that because I spent the previous decade managing farms here in Western Washington. First my own down around Olympia for about 5 years, growing diversified small organic veg. And then the second 5 years here on Whidbey Island at the Organic Farm School, pictured behind me, which was a farmer training program for aspiring farmers. And, a lot of the normal things, farmers market, CSA, grocery stores, but increasingly more and more seed contracts, partly for High Mowing, but also for another handful of companies, and got more and more into breeding as well, both with my own projects and with other industry partners like seed companies and nonprofits. And so it's great to be here. Thanks everyone for showing up. I'm going to kick things off by briefly just kind of setting the stage. If I can share the right screen. So seeds, foundation of agricultural systems. And we're going to look at this in a range of scales here, starting at the macro, but then spend most of the time at the micro. We're going to briefly talk about some like continental and regional seed systems, and then spend a lot of time focusing in on the nitty-gritty of practical aspects of seed and tuber storage and propagation. Because seeds, they're the foundation of the whole farming system, but they're also like the foundation of your farm every year. And before we get into it, I just wanted to briefly talk about seed sourcing, because before you plant seeds, you have to find them. You have to have somewhere to get them from. And so just a very brief historical perspective here. Throughout most of history, farms, communities, their regions, they produced and traded all the seed that they needed, because that is all they had. Like, it was by necessity very decentralized. And of course, they would trade with neighboring regions to add more variety. But this decentralization is why we are so fortunate to have these thousands of varieties of different vegetables. And the idea of a seed company really didn't come around until the late 19th century. And even then, communities and regions were mostly providing for their own seed needs. Then post-World War II, farming began to specialize more, and seed development and production was no exception there. Regions, localities started growing less of their own seed. They were buying it from larger companies. And then the increasing adoption and reliance on F1 hybrids made on-farm seed saving even trickier, because, to breed F1s, you're basically breeding 2 or 3 varieties instead of just one. But even with that, between the 40s and the 70s, regional seed companies really flourished across North America. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller seed companies focused on breeding for the conditions that were in those regions. But by the 70s, large companies were realizing the value of broad adaptability and vertical integration. And as farming became more centralized and production started to focus on the areas where crops did best, a lot of the breeding was focused on the varieties that did best in, the Central Valley of California, or Florida, or different parts of the country where things really thrived. So by the 80s, most new breeding was done primarily for those centers. Consolidation has continued since then. But I am really excited to be part of what I consider a movement right now of trying to decentralize seed systems once again to breed for local and regional adaptability while also building networks across the continent of these unique varieties that can also do well like all around the continent. And so we'll just briefly talk about, the seed sources used by farmers, probably not a surprise to a lot of you. There's the national or continental seed companies. I say continental because, we sell across North America. So there's High Mowing, William Dam, Vesey's, Johnny's, Osborne. Then there's also folks getting stuff from this new crop of regional seed companies that are popping up all over the place. It's very encouraging. Folks like Hawthorne Seeds and Kitchen Table Seeds in Ontario, Turn a Soul Cooperative in Quebec, and then down in the States, Fruition in New York, Adaptive Seeds in Oregon, Uprising Seeds in Washington. Just really cool stuff going on all over the country. But then another source you can get your seeds is just local seed growers. Like there are folks in my community who, we get seed from each other. We spent some time kind of stewarding a variety, and we kind of trade seeds back and forth. And then the coolest way to acquire seeds, in my opinion, is producing them yourself. And more folks are doing that. And those last two items are what Rebecca is going to talk about. So I am going to hand it over to her to talk about how Ontario farmers are becoming more involved in their seed systems.
Thank you, Aaron. I think just before I pop over to my slides, I know we had a little poll prepared that'll help us sort of hear what where you guys are at. Where are you, large scale organic producers, or are you backyard gardeners? It'll just help us as we move forward, speak to our audience. And then there's a second question there about just how long have you been growing vegetables? And that again will just help us know who's in the room. And while you fill that out, thank you. I see folks doing that. I'm going to share my slide. Hopefully that won't mess with the poll. No, Jamie is running the poll, so I'll let you finish that when you think you're ready, Jamie.
Just a quick note, you have to scroll down using the bar on the right-hand side to get to page 2. It took me a long time to figure that out.
Yeah,
Thanks.
just scroll down and there's a second question. And I'll just give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Looks like all the answers are in. So I'm going to end the poll and we can see who we're with here today. So what type of growers do we have? It looks like our highest is backyard gardeners, but we also have a good number of small scale organic producers, but a real mix, almost all of the different categories: market gardeners, future growers, people looking forward to getting into growing. Hopefully you'll pick up a couple tips and tricks here to get you started. And then how long have you been growing? And once again, split pretty evenly, but our highest is the 15-year plus. So we've got a lot of veteran growers here today. That's great. I hope that we have, well, I'm sure that there are things that will support all of you in your growing journey. So now that we know who we're speaking with, I'll pass it back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jimmy. So like Aaron said, I'm going to talk about some of these decisions that you'll need to make about how you're going to attain seeds, and that decision, those decisions are greatly influenced on how you know your seed system. And it was that slide from Aaron was really great on sort of looking through the history of how our seed system has changed. And with my seed program hat on, I'm so excited to be supporting growers across Ontario in creating these regional systems that Aaron was also excited about working with. Yeah, so through this program, you know, EFAO farmers are doing amazing work to increase their seed knowledge and their seed and variety literacy. And, you know, learning to get excited about seeds, not just as little things that you put in the soil to create your crops, but there are these like little packets of potential that really speak to a huge diversity of things. And I'm learning from growers. Growers are teaching themselves, and I'm also able to showcase some of the work that local seed growers and local breeders are doing. And through all of this, we're, you know, supporting people in changing the system and making it more secure and more resilient. And the work that I do to increase the quality, quantity, and diversity of ecological seed is really something that I think fits in with the theme of the conference in terms of it really builds resilience in the face of climate change. So I'm excited to talk about seed. I encourage folks, I'm going to talk about things at maybe a high level of what I've been hearing from farmers and working with folks on, but I'm happy to go into specifics. So I encourage you to ask questions, drop them into the Q&A, and we can get down to the nitty-gritty during our discussion period. So yeah, I'll lead you through some of the work that I get to be working with farmers on. So there's sort of 3 areas that I work on. That's preserving existing diversity of seed, improving and adapting existing varieties to Canadian climates. So our climates here in Ontario, which, you know, are different if you're living in Thunder Bay or if you're living on Pelee Island. And I'm also happy to work with farmers on creating new diversity. And Dwayne already mentioned some of that creation of new diversity. So, you know, there are many ways that we're doing this, but one of the fun things that I love doing is that I get to support smaller scale gardeners working with seeds of diversity. So seeds of diversity is a national seed saving group that collects and preserves seeds of Canada's food crops to ensure a genetically diverse seed supply in the future. That's an amazing goal. And through this program that I get to run with them through their community seed growouts, I get to both facilitate and participate in growing out seeds that will ensure that the seeds that they have in their seed bank are adapting to our climate. They're growing out, we are selecting them, and they're going back in, and then they'll be in the seed bank for a few years, and then they'll come back out. And Erin will talk, I believe, a little bit about how long seeds are viable for. And I just also want to mention, because we're talking about how you can access seeds, and I think Seeds of Diversity does an amazing work at supporting farmers and growers in many other ways, particularly, you know, they help to facilitate many Seedy Saturdays across the country where you can get seeds from those seeds companies that Erin mentioned. The small seed companies are often at those places, but there's also some of the local growers will be there and you can exchange seed. And again, it's small scale, but sometimes you don't need, even if you have a big market garden, you don't need that many tomato seeds of a particular variety. So these smaller scale exchanges of seed is really important. And another place that Seeds of Diversity really gets to work on is they have a membership exchange. So I've used that membership exchange, which is free as of this year. You join and you can share varieties of seed with other growers. You can get varieties that I might not be able to find in some of the seed catalogs that I also love looking at and buying seeds from, like High Mowing or Fedco or other companies. So that's, I think, some of the amazing work that Seeds of Diversity does. They also have the Ecological Seed Finder. So sometimes I'm looking for a particular variety of cabbage, for example. I'm not sure who in my area is offering that cabbage, and you can go to the Ecological Seed Finder, you can Google it, and you can see who's offering that variety. So it's a great place in terms of when you're thinking about where you're accessing small quantities of seed. But, you know, part of becoming aware of the range of seed varieties available is to do, that might do well on your farm, is to do variety trials. And I see some names of those in the audience of folks who have participated in variety trials. And these variety trials give farmers the opportunity to learn, to be observant, and to see what that seed source matters, because that's another thing that was pretty cool. For example, the lettuce growers of last year or the year before who did a variety trial, they had the same variety but from 2 different sources, and it really did show them that seed source matters. So learning about that, and just these variety trials people get excited about diversity and learning about what does well on their farm. And I've been working with the Canovi project, which is the Canadian Organic Vegetable Improvement Project. And that project is sort of wrapping up its 4th season, and we hope to continue in the future, but we won't be doing trials across Canada this year, and we're focusing more on regional trials. And that gets me really excited because I get to hear from farmers, what do they want to trial on their farms? And farmers across Ontario have been submitting to EFAO ideas and curiosities about varieties they might want to trial. I've heard from folks already that, you know, they want to work on learning what iceberg lettuce does well on their farm and will meet the needs of their customers. And some folks are interested in what squash variety will meet those needs that I mentioned, but also will have, you know, a tasty flesh and delicious pepitos. So they want to do a variety trial on that. And these variety trials are replicated and randomized, and they're usually done across different farms, and the data is collected by the farmers, and then research staff at EFAO get to help with statistical analysis and write reports. And I loved hearing from Angie Koch, who is a CSA farmer and a participant in the last 3 years of lettuce trials. And she recently told one of my fellow colleagues that, and I'm going to quote, "The trial made me pay attention in ways that we might not otherwise pay attention. Even if the statistics didn't quite pull out the story I thought it told, we could see that story ourselves, and we could tell the story because we were paying attention differently." So I mentioned some folks are submitting ideas about variety trials through the farmer-led research program here at EFAO, and there's other ways that people have curiosities regarding seed on their farm. So we've done a variety of work to answer specific questions of farmers. For example, Kim Delaney at Hawthorne Farm Organic Seeds, who Erin mentioned, wanted to know what isolation distance was needed between her flower crops of the same species. So we worked with her to design a trial to test 2 different isolation distances, and learning that the short isolation distance was too short. It did produce a beautiful mix of red and white there that you can see, but the longer distance did work for her, meant that she can grow seeds with more confidence. And I love, you know, supporting growers to produce seed with more confidence. And as I mentioned, it was through the farmer-led research program that Dwayne is working on his overwintering pea work, but also that I worked with the Seed Works Plant Breeding Club to receive some support for our breeding of a pepper that's now released as Renegade Red. And so there's lots of different ways that folks are getting involved in seed research on their own farm. And I think there's also other growers, for example, some quinoa variety trials that were happening with folks in the audience here. Now, speaking of crops that could be field crops, so we have also worked with the creation of new diversity, and we do that through our participatory plant breeding programs, which we shorten to PPB. So PPB pairs farmers' knowledge with the skills of formal plant breeders, and it's really increasingly being recognized as an effective approach to develop better varieties for organic farming system, because it's like not only uses the environmental conditions of a working farm, but it also incorporates all the knowledge that folks like yourself have on like your needs, your observations, the social and cultural dimensions that are important in variety development. So since 2013, farmers have been selecting wheat and oat varieties in small plots on their fields. And when they like what they're selecting, we have the opportunity to compare these selections to conventional varieties and the selections of other farmers on common garden plots. With the potatoes, that's done in New Brunswick. Dwayne mentioned that it's done at AAFC in New Brunswick. For the wheat and oats, that's done in the prairies. And just like the variety trials, people are looking at different, heights and yields and disease resistance. And then with the data, farmers can choose to register their new selections as varieties. And this is a process because it involves a lot of policies and regulations, but my colleague Christy, who's the policy analyst with the Bauta initiative, is going to be working with farmers to navigate these regulations. And you can see just some of the potatoes that came out of Dwayne's true potato seed that was shared with growers. And I just love seeing the diversity that can come out of crops. I think something I'm super excited about in the coming year is that the Bauta initiative has received an important grant to continue the work that we've been doing across Canada, but through EFAO here in Ontario, from the Canadian Agricultural Strategies and Priorities Program. It's a program of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So, farmers and seed growers are engaged in various ways in developing crops, in adapting varieties, and we want to showcase the work that they've been doing with us and without us for years now. And we have the capacity to create a series of demonstration and evaluation sites to showcase and evaluate varieties and have folks come to the sites and view the varieties, see some of the variety trials that farmers are doing. We could do, on these sites as well. These sites could be used as a place where you can bulk up seed that's harder to find. Anyways, we can do some baking and testing activities. There's lots of cool things that we can do at these sites. And we're in the process of figuring out where we'll be in the coming year, but we have an on-farm site that'll be hopefully just outside of Kitchener. And then we have a relationship with the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, where we'll also be working on some a variety trial of 4 red carrot varieties and 6 orange carrot varieties that were selected by farmers. So it's brand new varieties that can be selected. Very excited about that and hope that folks get engaged. Jamie or Erin, you want to give me a little time check?
We're at like just past 12:30, so it's been 12. You're got a couple minutes.
Super. Super. Well, I'm gonna perhaps, I've sort of looked at this big picture, and these are sort of areas in which I'm engaged with farmers, and you can see that this regional seed system is becoming more robust through this work. But something that I think maybe all of us can do, whether we are a large scale organic grain producer, but we also have a backyard garden, or we live in the city and we have a backyard garden or a patio, or perhaps you're a market gardener, one of the things that we can do is start just saving some seed. And something super easy would be a bean. Dwayne highly suggested I talk about beans, which I also love greatly, but I also have some beautiful pictures of my next favorite crop, which are tomatoes. So I'm going to talk just briefly about how you might go about saving a tomato seed, because that's one way of accessing seed. And when you think about where you're going, you're going to save your tomato seed from, well, you have to plant some plants. And in many ways, planting a seed-saving garden is the same as planting any garden. You want the plants to receive soil and water and light. And you also want them to reach the end of their life cycle as healthy and productively as possible. And there are, wonderful tips that many of us could share about how to do that. But I just want to say that when you're thinking about seed saving, there are two main differences that you have to realize that plants grown for seed often need to grow for a longer time period than if you're using them for their edible parts. I'm going to say maybe not so much for my example of tomatoes, but if you think about lettuce, lettuce gets to the beautiful stage you want to put in a salad, but then it needs to stay there a lot longer in order to get to the seed stage. And the other thing that you need to think about is that varieties of the same species have to be isolated from each other, usually by a certain distance, but that kind of depends on how the flower is shaped and how it's pollinated and how mixed up the pollen is going to get. So, the popular members of this particular family I'm going to talk about, which is the Solanaceas family. A thing is very helpful to know when you're seed saving is what the kinship between the different plants. So what family is it belonging to? So peppers and tomatoes and eggplants are all part of this family. And they're pretty easy to save seed from, but tomatoes in particular are self-pollinating usually, and hence ideal for beginners. So they have flowers that have the pollen producing part and the pollen receiving part all in one flower. And it's usually encased in the tube. You can see in the picture in the bottom right. Usually it's, inside that tube and all the pollination is happening in there. So there are varieties like more wild and more ancient tomato varieties that you'll see that the parts are sticking out there, and then that means it's a little bit more easy to get the pollen mixed up between varieties. But there's but it's not super likely to happen, and you don't need so much isolation distance between your varieties. So this is a little chart on the left here that's from an amazing little book from Seeds of Diversity, just called How to Save Your Own Seeds. And it shows that, how many plants you might need to plant and the isolation distance there. What else do I have to say about tomatoes? So when you're thinking about what tomatoes to plant, it's nice to think about where are the seeds coming from and what kind of seeds are there. So you want an open pollinated variety if you would like to save seed and then plant that and have it produce the same kind of plant again. So not a hybrid, because it won't come true to type. And as with all seed saving endeavors, if you look at your tomato plants in your garden and you see any sick looking plants or plants that don't have the characteristics you want to be able to pull them out. So these tomatoes that I'm showing here are a diversity of tomatoes, but perhaps I just will talk about this particular tomato, which came with this little note here. Not many of us can read it. I cannot read Cyrillic, but this came from a family friend, Lubka, and she gave me these seeds for these large rose tomatoes, large sort of pink tomatoes. And I really wanted to be able to grow them year after year, so I planted them out. I had six plants. I isolated them by around 5 meters, which is around 16 feet. And I grew them. They look beautiful. They're kind of ox hardy shaped, and I was very excited about them. They taste great. I love a tomato sandwich, but they also can be cooked down into, a pasta. And so I harvested fresh ripe tomatoes from these beautiful plants. I cut them in half. You scoop out the seeds out of these little cavities, and you put them into a container, and it's all goopy and kind of saucy. The cool thing about tomatoes is that they have this casing on them that prevents them from germinating within the nice, moist, hot tomato on the plant. So this jelly, the one you try to pick up a tomato seed on your cutting board and it just wants to jump away like a little jumping frog made of origami. But anyways, that jelly sac is preventing germination from happening. So you want to ferment that off. So then you take your your container with all of your tomato goop in it, and you let it ferment. So it gets all white and goopy and smelly like this. And it usually doesn't take that long. It kind of depends on the heat. You don't want it to get really cold and you don't want it to get really hot, but it does, you know, on a warm day in our climate, usually on the counter is fine in a few days, say 3 days. The pulp will rot and ferment and the seeds sort of start sinking to the bottom. And so then you add a little bit of water and you pour off the top and you decant it until you get all of these nice clean tomato seeds, and you rinse them well, and then you put them onto something like a plate or you know, a pie tin. Don't put them onto a paper towel because they get too sticky stick to the paper towel when you dry. But the other thing I want to mention, which is not well documented in my photos, is that you would like to label everything, because that is important, especially if you're saving more than one tomato seed, because tomato seeds all look the same. So then you rinse them all, you don't have any pulp left, it's all, you look at your seeds, you can see that they're kind of fuzzy and they don't have a jelly sack on them anymore, and you've dried them out nice and dry on your plate, and then there's your seed, and you can take it and put it in, you know, in a little, I like to put my things in little seed envelopes, like coin envelopes, but anything like that. And then I take those coin envelopes and I put them in little glass jars, and I have them in a cooler place in my house, and they will store fully, you know, dry in an air container for, you know, at least 5 years. And if they're really nice and cool and dry, it can be a lot longer. And I believe, Erin, you may speak more to that, but that is something that I think is really easy. You can, you know, you now have available for folks through a seed exchange or through just, you know, knowing me, and we can exchange this tomato that I don't believe is growing around here. That's increasing our diversity. I get excited about this tomato. That's, you know, wonderful for everyone, and it tastes great, and it's being grown out by folks, so it's adapting to our climate. So that is one way, one easy crop to save, and I think everyone can do it. But perhaps with that, I will pass it over to Dwayne, and Dwayne is going to talk about not seeds in this capacity, but vegetative seeds, which I think is super cool. So I'll stop sharing, Dwayne. Pass it over to you.
Okay, I just have to unmute. I'm just going to answer a question that came up very quickly. In the lower right-hand corner of your slide, Rebecca, was your rotting tomato seed.
Oh, yes.
By the way, if you stir that every day, it doesn't smell nearly as bad. And one little trick I use is I use a coffee filter for straining them and drying them, because they're much stiffer than a paper towel, so they don't break up so bad. It's easy to peel the seeds off of them, just kind of rub them off. And then you can reuse your coffee filter. Not for coffee, but for seeds. Yeah. And it is very good to label them. I'm going to try my screen share now and see how we do. It didn't come up the way I expected it to. There it did.
Yes, we're all good here. We can see it.
Okay. I would like to start out by saying we're going to talk about something very different, because potato seed or seed potatoes is not the same thing as tomato seed, even though they are a member of the Solanum family. Potatoes happen to be perennial, and they are very long-lived perennials, but they go through a cycle. They grow vegetatively and beautifully in the summer, and then they go dormant. And they stay dormant for 6 months or so, and then they want to grow again. And unfortunately, you cannot save them for 5 years like you can with tomato seeds. So you have to produce seed every fall, and you have to grow that seed out every spring, or you lose your potatoes. However, you don't have to worry about pollination because it's vegetative, and what you're saving is actually a clone of what you started with, whatever it is. So if you get a good potato, you can save it, but you have to do it properly. So I want to talk about producing good seed, how to harvest good seed, cleaning, sorting, and conditioning your seed potatoes, winter storage, which is critical, spring preparation, which is quite important, and then how to plant seed potatoes to get good seed back, and hopefully good eating potatoes as well. Okay, so the first step in producing good quality seed potatoes is to produce a good, healthy potato crop. You need good fertility, you need weed control, you need insect control, you need disease management, and hopefully you get a good environment as well. There's one other key element here, and I think most good farmers know about this, and that's rotation, rotation, rotation. Make sure that the land is in good condition for the potatoes before you start from the previous crop. And potatoes are fairly heavy feeders. They need nitrogen, they need good soil organic matter, they need good soil till. So it's important to make the soil right before you plant your potatoes. And then after the potatoes, because they're heavy feeders, the soil's not in great condition. So you need to follow them with a crop that will start to build the soil back up again. So you've grown good potatoes. How do you harvest good quality seed potatoes? You need to harvest, like tomatoes, fully mature tubers. That is, the vines need to die down, which makes them much easier to dig. And ideally, you get a vine-killing frost or natural maturity, because as those vines die down, they translocate nutrients to the tuber, giving you a much healthier tuber, full of nutrients, ready to go again in the spring. And the stolons that connect the tuber to the plant also dry up. So you can actually get your tubers off of the plant. Makes it much easier. And that leads us to field conditioning. So after the plants die down, you need to actually leave them in the field for up to 2 weeks, because at that point in time, the tubers actually mature and the skin hardens and thickens considerably, so you don't damage them so much when you actually dig them. When you do dig them, you need to make sure that the soil temperature is fairly cool. If the soil temperature is hot, it predisposes the potato tubers to bruising and poor storage quality. And you need also cool air temperature. So don't harvest them on a hot afternoon, because again, it leads them into a situation where bruising can cause rot. You also need reasonably dry soil. Otherwise, all of the soil sticks to the tuber and you've got a muddy mess. So conditions aren't always perfect, but you do the best you can. Ideally, you dig them in a cool morning after the dew is gone. Let them air dry for an hour or two, hopefully not in the bright sun, and then collect them and get them inside out of the light. And there's a good reason for that, because light causes greening. And you may notice that sometimes you get a tuber that has a green shoulder or something where it was exposed to the light because it wasn't covered in soil. Greening in potatoes gives rise to glycoalkaloids, which are toxic. So anytime you have green on a potato, cut it off or just get rid of the potato itself. It's could be bad news. So this is what it should look like at about the time of harvest. And I'm going to try something here. Yes. The green stuff you see here are actually weeds that have come up after the potatoes matured. So these are in great shape for harvest. We got a frost about a week before this. They've matured up. We're trying to harvest them now. I'm probably a little bit bigger than most of the backyard gardeners that I noticed showing up in the poll. I have a digger. It's great, but we have to be careful and only dig enough potatoes that we can handle them and process them in that day, because you do not want potatoes to sit outside overnight. They get dew on them. It really predisposes them to rotting. So for quality preservation, get them up, let them air dry a little bit, and then get them out of the field into a drier, cooler, darker environment. However, sometimes you have to take advantage of opportunities, like when you have labor available. Maybe you can't let the potatoes mature up quite so well. You harvest them when you've got the labor. It happens. However, ideally, you should pick up all of the potatoes, put them into mesh bags or burlap bags that breathe so that they can actually dry out more, and that helps the soil fall off the surface. It's great for harvesting cleaner potatoes. These are the mesh bags that we use. They're nylon bags. You can get them from different sources, also known as onion bags. And you can certainly repurpose an onion bag to become a potato bag. This is the tool that I use for hand digging. It did have a much longer handle on it, but it was so hard to move soil with a long handle. I just shortened the handle and use it as almost like a fork sideways. And it really does help move potatoes because it doesn't move as much soil as a fork does, but it does get the potatoes out. This gives you an idea of some of the diversity that we're dealing with in our breeding program. Okay, so you've harvested good potatoes. Now we have to do something called post-harvest conditioning. And this is very important for storability. So you want to put them in your breathable bags, either a mesh bag or a burlap bag, under fairly dry conditions for a week or two, so that the soil can all dry up, and then it's easy to get it off. You want to slowly reduce the temperatures from 20 in the field down to 12 to 16 degrees. I have a shed that's built like a bank barn. It's always cool. I just put the potatoes in there. As the nights get cooler, it slowly cools off. It's just plain ideal. So Mother Nature is doing most of the work. You also want to make sure that you're not in a high humid condition because you'll get condensation. And good air circulation usually helps with that. So sometimes you just need to put a fan in just to keep the air moving so you don't get these wet spots that start to rot. And the most important thing is that they are in the dark or covered. Otherwise you get glycoalkaloids. So we use just a kind of a tarp over everything, even though it's in a shed. I took it off just to take a picture, but the tarp went back on as soon as I was done. So it keeps them in the dark because if they green up, they're toxic. Now, once you've got them conditioned, you need to clean them and sort them. So we brush the soil off by hand. You can get these tactile rubber gloves. It makes it very easy to do. And we literally hand brush every potato that we process. And you want to handle them gently because these potatoes are quite moist. They're quite turgid. They actually have pressure on the inside. If you drop one from a table to the floor, it can split. And if they split, they're going to rot. So you have to be very careful. Commercial handlers never let a potato drop more than 2 feet. And if it does, it drops onto a cushioned platform of some kind. So potatoes, they're pretty tough, but they have to be handled very gently. At this time, you need to remove the damaged potatoes because they're going to rot, bruised potatoes that haven't rotted yet, but they will, diseased potatoes, misshapen potatoes because you're not going to be able to sell them, and green tubers. Anything that's green coming in, you don't want to store for eating. However, you can compost most of the bad ones. The seconds are the potatoes that have some damage, but they're still quite edible. And the green ones can be used for seed. So you may not want to eat them, but they sure make good seed quality. So we sort them into table potatoes, which are the larger medium-sized potatoes for eating, seed potatoes, which are a little bit smaller, and creamers, which are the tiny potatoes or new potatoes. They're great for eating fresh. And again, when you're sorting them, you need some light. As soon as you're done sorting them, get them out of the light. Light is bad news. According to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, we have #1 potatoes in small size, creamer size, chef size, and large size. But you'll notice that these sizes go from 57 millimeters to 70 millimeters, and there's a gap in between. And what fills that gap in? Seed potatoes. Now, seed potatoes are a medium to small potato. You don't want a real small potato because it doesn't produce very vigorous or very big shoots. You don't want a big potato because it produces too many shoots or too many eyes on a big potato. You wind up getting too much competition in the hill and a bunch of small potatoes as a result. So if you plant a big potato, you're going to harvest little potatoes. It's unfortunately the way it goes. A golf ball is just about the smallest size you would want for a seed potato. Most of them should be the size of a large egg or perhaps a little bit larger. So seed potatoes are a size of potato more than a class of potato. The big ones you eat, the little ones you can eat them too. So we sort the potatoes by hand. and brush the soil off at the same time. And then they go into some sort of paper, and paper bags without windows. The last thing you want to do is have a window in that bag, which you see in the store all the time. You don't want those potatoes to see light. You want to keep them in the dark. So we actually get commercial potato bags. They're 40 to 50 cents each. We buy enough to last us 4 or 5 years. They're great because they're extra heavy paper. You staple them shut. You've got about 5 kilos of potatoes in each bag. They last a long time. We also repurposed something called an LCBO bag. So anybody from Ontario knows exactly what that is and probably does the same thing. They're good bags. Those bags are usually what we put the large green seed potatoes in that are going to need to be cut, or the seconds that we're going to eat. We also use boxes. These boxes hold about 20 pounds of potatoes, and they're good for creamers or anything else. But the idea is keep the light out. And this will be covered by a tarp as soon as I get finished taking the picture. The last thing you want to do is put potatoes in plastic. And the reason is that it sweats. And as soon as you get water contacting the potato, you get rot. You want them to be able to breathe because they transpire all winter long. Make sure they can breathe that whole time and make sure you keep them in the dark. So for winter, we've processed our potatoes, we've got them ready to store. How do we store them? Well, the idea of winter storage is to maintain that dormancy as long as possible because they're dormant when they go in the fall. Temperature is a big factor. You want to keep them quite cold for seed. Now, for eating potatoes, you want to keep them cool, not quite that cold, because there's a phenomenon known as cold sweetening, where the potatoes actually convert starch to sugars because sugar is an antifreeze and starch is not. So when they get cold, they think they're going to freeze, so they convert the starch to sugar. It gives you a sweetening. You might think a sweet potato tastes good. Take my word for it, it does not. It's not sucrose, it's other sugars. They don't really taste very good. But you can reverse this by warming them up for a week to 10 days. So if you store your potatoes really cold and you want to eat some, take the eating potatoes out of cold storage about a week or so before you need them. Keep them at room temperature in the dark, and that cold sweetening will reverse itself. They'll convert the sugar back to starch, and they're going to be great. You also need a humidity of about 60 to 70%. You don't want it to be too humid because you don't want condensation. And the best way to prevent that is ventilation or by keeping some air moving. Now, at these cold temperatures, usually the humidity is fairly low anyway. So you don't have to be too careful as long as you're in an area where you've got ventilation. Another point, which we learned the hard way, is don't stack your bags because that prevents air circulation. And something else that most people probably already know, never store potatoes with onions or apples. They produce ethylene gas. Ethylene is a germination gas. It promotes growth. They will start to sprout right away. And don't forget to keep them in the dark. I hope I'm emphasizing that enough. This is our potato storage. The ones on the bottom are ones for commercial production. We sell them to people. The ones in these paper bags are seconds. That's what we eat. And the ones on the top shelf, which get really good air circulation, that's our seed potatoes for next year. So that gives you an idea of how much potato we grow because this is what we need for seed. And the ones in the brown bags here are the large seed, probably from green tubers or something that was maybe damaged a little bit that can still be used as seed. We know we're going to have to cut those. The ones in the small bags are ready to plant. Now, this is our little weather station. This is the inside temperature, 20 degrees. This is the outside temperature on the 15th of January this year at about 10:43 in the morning. You notice that it's 20.8 inside and it's minus 20.8 outside. That's a 41.6 degree difference in temperature from inside and out. And if anybody's ever been on a 40-degree day, they know how significant that is. This is our cold room. This is where the potatoes are. They're at 4 degrees, 59% humidity. They're happily sleeping away. They're essentially hibernating, just the way we want them to do. So winter storage, great. Eventually we get spring, even in Ontario. When that happens, the potatoes start to wake up. Their dormancy will eventually break. They start to sprout. Different varieties have different levels of dormancy. No matter where you store them, eventually they know it's spring outside and they start to sprout. When that happens, it's time to do something with them. You want to make sure this doesn't happen. It's kind of cute, but that's the last thing you want to see in your potato storage. So when the dormancy breaks, you need to move them to a low light area. Now, sure, they'll green up, but these are seed potatoes. You don't want to move your table potatoes to a light area. If they start to sprout, eat them. Do something with them, but don't let them green up. So light is interesting because it inhibits sprout elongation. The reason the sprouts elongate, and you get those long white sprouts, they're looking for light. If you give them light, they stop elongating. And not only do they stop, but leaves and roots will actually differentiate on this short little sprout. Now, you probably need to take them out of the bag that you've had them in because it was meant to keep the light out. We normally put them into milk crates. You know, those milk crates that you find or fall off the back of a truck and so on. They're great. They hold about 3 bags of potatoes. They have holes in all sides. Put them in an area of low light, but not too warm. Say your garage near a window or something. And then maybe every 3 or 4 days, turn them. You don't need to move the potatoes or anything. They don't need very much light. They just need a little bit. And if you increase the humidity a little bit, that will help keep them from drying out because they're going to be warmer. This process is known as green sprouting. And it is the best thing you can do for your potatoes. Once they start to sprout, get them into an environment where they can green sprout. So when they start to sprout like this, and they can do that no matter how cold you have them. Some varieties do it in March, some don't do it until June. So storability depends on the variety. When you take something like this and put it in the light, the sprouts stop growing. They start to differentiate little leaves and little roots, and they're preparing themselves to get planted. These sprouts also become very firm. It's very difficult to break them off when you're handling the potato. That's one of the really nice benefits. You can get really artistic about it and you can put them in egg cartons. We, of course, don't bother. They don't need much light. So put them in a milk carton, 20, 30 pounds together. As long as the light can get into it, they'll be just fine and they will give you green sprouting. You can also see the size. These are a little bit bigger than a golf ball. These are the size of a big egg. These are a little bit bigger. That's exactly the range of size you want for a seed potato. What you're really trying to do is prevent this. You don't want these sprouts to elongate in the dark. It makes them very fragile. They're using energy from the potato. They're going to break off. And in fact, when they do this, the best thing you can do is break them off. They're going to break off anyway. They're going to cause damage. You can break them off and they'll actually start to sprout from some of the other eyes on the same potato or even new sprouts from here, but they'll be young, healthy sprouts. This is what you're going to get when you break off the big ones. This, if it was put in the light, these would turn green and they would stay exactly that same size for the next month. They've got nice little roots on them. This potato is ready to plant. Now, this potato has gone way too far. It started to form tubers in storage. That's the last thing you want to see because those don't actually grow. They're essentially going to die. So ideally, you want a young seed piece or a middle-aged seed piece with a few small sprouts or more sprouts on them. You do not want long white sprouts, and you do not want to see these tubers. These are called no-top because they will never actually germinate and produce a plant. They're essentially done. So ideally, you want this kind of a potato for a seed piece. So we now have green sprouted potatoes or potatoes that are starting to sprout. It's time to get them ready for planting. If they haven't sprouted, what you can do is do some temperature fluctuation to wake them up. Take your potato from the cold storage, move it out into a warm area for a couple of days, back into cold storage for a few more days, then back out into warm. That almost always stimulates them to sprout. So 2 or 3 weeks before you plan to plant, if they haven't sprouted, wake them up and get them going. If you have any with long sprouts, break them off a couple weeks before you plan to plant. They will resprout and be in much better shape for planting. You need to start warming them up. So if you've had them green sprouting in the garage and it's fairly cool, move them to an area that's a little bit warmer. You really want them to start thinking about growing. Now, at this point in time, if you have large tubers that you want to plant, you need to cut them into smaller seed pieces with 2 or 3 eyes only, because you don't want 10 eyes sprouting. Again, you get little potatoes. You want to cut them 1 to 2 weeks before you plant. That way they have time to callus over or heal over, and they'll be dry at the time of planting. They're not going to rot. Or, strangely enough, if you cut them right at planting time, as soon as you put them in the soil, they'll start to grow, and somehow there's something in the soil that prevents them from rotting as well. The reaction to being in the soil stops them from rotting. If you cut them a week before you plant and they're kind of soft and a little wet when you plant them, they'll rot right away. But if you cut them right before planting, they seem to be fine. Now, one key thing is potato temperature should be similar to soil temperature. You don't want the potatoes too cold and plant them into warm soil, because it'll take them too long to wake up and actually grow. And you really don't want to plant a warm potato into cold soil, because they go into shock and they don't sprout. It really delays growth. So you want the soil temperature and the potato temperature or the planting tuber temperature to be very similar. And then everything's happy and away they go. Another key thing is you want to plant potatoes shallow. You want a little bit of soil over them, but not too much, because with a little bit of soil, it encourages sprouting and establishment, and you're going to be hilling them later anyway. So you're going to be adding soil to them later. You do have to have some soil over the tuber, because the roots are produced by the sprout, which comes from the tuber. So they produce no roots below the tuber or from other parts of the tuber. It's only from the sprout. You want to space them in the row far enough away that you reduce early competition, but close enough together that you get closure within the row before too long. And usually that's 8, 10, 12 inches apart within the row. Now, in our case, because we hill them mechanically, we do not want to get closure between the rows. We need that open, otherwise we're driving on our potatoes. So our rows are actually spaced a little bit further apart than most, just because of the way we manage them. But within the row, we plant normally about 10 inches to 12 inches apart. So this is what your seed piece would be like. When the plant grows, it grows above that seed piece. The roots are produced in this lower part. Now you want to hill them, because they also produce stolons, which have tubers in this area above where the original soil line was, but in the soil. You also want to hill them because you're scraping the weeds off here and you're burying the weeds here. Hilling is a fantastic weed control measure. It also protects these tubers, which are forming up here in the upper part of the stem below ground. It protects them from getting green. If they're exposed at the edge of this hill to the light, they turn green. And so when you dig them, essentially they're already toxic. They're okay for seed, but you don't want to eat them. So hilling accomplishes a lot of different things. It's very traditional in potatoes, and it's very good. There's a lot of good reasons to hill potatoes. So I hope I've covered most of the considerations that you need for storing good seed potatoes for next year. So you need to produce good quality seed potatoes. You need to harvest good quality seed potatoes. You need to clean, sort, and condition those potatoes. You need to store them properly over winter. You need to prepare them for planting. And then you plant them, and hopefully you'll grow good quality potatoes, because good quality potatoes are where you're going to get good quality seed from. It's a circular thing. They're the same crop. It's just you're saving some for seed so that you get a crop next year. So ideally, we'll all have a great season and grow good, tasty potatoes. And I have a couple little notes to add. The first one is, remember those creamer potatoes, those little potatoes that were too small for seed? Well, they make great new potatoes, right? But they're covered in soil and so on. So I learned a trick from YouTube, from something called a Russian potato peeler. Believe me, it doesn't peel potatoes. That is a very stiff toilet brush, which was never used in a toilet. I cut it off, has a round handle. I put it in my drill. I put potatoes in a bucket of water. I massage them rather ungently with the drill at high speed for 2 to 3 minutes, drain them through a colander, and you've got the best looking new potatoes you can imagine. Boil them for 15 or 20 minutes, and it's just like new potatoes in April. They're great. It sure beats trying to peel them, and the skins are usually fairly thin. They taste good. That also gives you kind of an idea of the diversity of potatoes we're working with. But if you want real diversity, go to Peru and try those potatoes on for size. So I've tried to tell you a little bit about potatoes. I hope that you all have a great season, and you should be able to grow really good potatoes from here on in. So I don't know if we want to answer questions right now or keep going. Jamie, I think it's up to you.
I think we can answer some of, if there's some specific potato questions. I'm just looking here. Laura Boyle asked, sometimes the potato will flower and then produce what looks like a tomato. We've called potato berries. They look like they are full of seeds like a tomato, but could they be planted? Would they create tiny seed potatoes?
Well, that's an easy question to answer. Yes. They're related to tomatoes. That's why it looks like a tomato. The seeds are like small tomato seeds, and you can process them just like Rebecca showed and get a little tomato seed out. You can plant them. However, they are the product of sexual recombination. They give you the kind of diversity that you saw in my previous slide. Who knows what they're going to be like? We eliminate about 90% of the ones that we grow from true seed because that's where the breeding comes in. A lot of them are very susceptible to disease. They're the wrong kind of plants. They either have no tubers or tiny tubers or big, ugly tubers. You're back into the breeding game. If you want a challenge, go for it. But the negative side is you have no idea what you're going to get. You are going to get diversity. The positive side is if you see something you like and you save that tuber, you're now back into seed potatoes rather than potato seed, and you can propagate that because it's now a clone. And that's exactly how potatoes are bred. You make a genetic cross between two varieties, produce those little seed balls, harvest them, process them, plant them out, and then you start cloning the ones that meet your criteria. So if you want a challenge, go for it. You might get something really good.
Thank you, Jane. And then there's a couple people who are asking, I think you mentioned you do shallow planting, but about how deep is shallow then? Like how deep are we planting them?
You're planting them an inch or two below the native soil surface. With my potato planter, it actually digs a little trench and then it hills a little bit behind it. I want that seed tuber to be an inch or two below the soil surface when it's planted. Because the soil is warmer right at the top, it gets them sprouting faster. Then once they get going, when they get 4 or 5 inches tall, then it's time to start hilling them. And by that time, some of the little weeds are starting to go. It's weed control and it's potato management at the same time. So plant shallow and then hill. We hill probably 3 times during the summer for weed control and to give that potato an environment where it can produce the best quality tubers and the most tubers, because most of the tubers are up above that seed piece.
Great, thank you. And then we'll ask one last potato specific question. There are some other questions that I think we'll address in the Q&A after Erin presents, but the last potato question is why do you recommend not washing the potatoes before storing them?
Because anytime you contact water with a potato, it gives you the potential for rot. Bacteria and fungi love free water. And unless you can dry it off right away, don't wash it. Wash them just before you eat them because you're going to cook them shortly. The potatoes that you buy in the store that are washed are dried very quickly afterwards. And sometimes it still leads to some rotting. So water and potatoes should never mix until you're ready to eat it. And then you cook them in water and eat them right away. So it's just to help prevent rotting in storage. Brush the soil off. In most cases, we don't wash them before peeling them, because by brushing them off, if they're nice and dry, you get 95% of the soil off. Another reason we brush the soil off in the fall when we're sorting them is we save that soil. That's my good potato producing dirt. I don't want anybody else to get it. We save it and put it in the garden. It's good stuff.
Thank you, Dwayne. I think with that, it would be great to move on to Erin. And like I said, we do see that there's some other questions, but we'll take those after Erin's done.
All right. Yeah, thanks, folks. Thanks, Dwayne. That was a lot of great information. So I'm going to talk about similar things, but on the seed side of it. We'll discuss various factors in germination success, and then focus on a couple of crops that we get more questions about than any others, just folks having trouble germinating. So yeah, we're going to go from the point of like, now you've got the seeds, and then take it through to you got a nice stand of whatever crop you're trying to get. There we go. But before we get the seeds, I just wanted to share a little bit about what seed companies do to ensure that we're sending good seed to you. And I can only speak confidently in specifics about High Mowing's program, but I'm guessing a lot of the seed companies that you're all buying from employ very similar procedures. So first of all, like we trial everything in our catalog, we trial in our trials field in Vermont. For at least 2 seasons. And then once it's in the catalog, we trial it every couple of years just to make sure it's still performing the way we intended it. We also have a cleaning mill in our facility where we bring in the seed, mostly the seed we grow. We have folks grow on contract to do the final cleaning to get it to a purity level that works for your different like seeding mechanisms. We also test germination rates. Every 6 months, we do a germ test on every lot that we sell, and we kind of time those germination tests based on when we expect to sell them. So like for onions and leeks, people are buying those early because they're seeding them, I mean, maybe even now. So we'll do germination tests on those in November, December. You know, for beans, we might wait to do them, you know, until like March or April, just because we want the results to be as recent as they can be before folks are planting them. And along with the germination rate, this kind of gets to a question that was asked that I can get more into later, but we're also testing for vigor there too. So each germination test, like there's a deadline. Say like for arugula, it should germinate in anywhere from, I don't know, like 4 to 7 days. Like there's a cutoff day. If by day 8, it's not sprouting, for example, like it's done, even if it were going to germinate on day 9. Because like vigor, we know is just as important as germinating. We also freeze some seed that is prone to like seed-borne pests, like weevils in peas or corn. Just it's our regular process to just take those bags of seed, put them in deep freeze for a month, and that kills the weevils. We also make sure that our peas specifically are true to type. Some of you may remember maybe a handful of years ago, there was a lot of crosses and pea seed out in the world. So we've done a lot of work getting those back to on type. And then once we receive the pea seed, we grow them out to the first pods so that we make sure that they actually are a sugar snap pea. They're not, you know, crossed with a shell pea. We also do GMO testing on everything and disease testing on some crops. I think we test for tobacco mosaic virus on tomatoes, and then blackleg and black rot on all of our brassica seeds. And if in the event we do come back with a positive test on blackleg or black rot, we do have a system in place at headquarters to hot water treat them. So, and it seems like we all know about viral loads now, right? Like if the amount of blackleg or black rot in a seed lot is low enough, we're usually pretty successfully able to treat it and eradicate the disease so that we can sell it. And something I just learned about this year is that we also test for hybridity. So all the F1 hybrids that we sell, we send them out, and there's a test they can run to make sure that the seeds are in fact hybrids and not just, selfers of one of the parent lines or the other. And the standard we use is 95% hybridity. So 95 seeds out of 100 has to be a true hybrid. Which explained to me, oh yeah, that's why, like, I remember an acorn squash I grew a few years ago, like there were a couple of plants where they just looked a lot different than the other ones. And that's, some of that 5% that's not a true hybrid. The other thing we do is store them in an optimal condition. We actually just built a new bulk storage facility where it's, temperature and humidity controlled. I think it's 40 degrees, 40% humidity. So, not too far above freezing, but very dry. And that allows us to store seeds for a long amount of time. This is another question that I think came up that we can get to later, like old seed versus new seed. And there's issues around that, but we are able to store things for quite a long time in our facility. And like a request for all of you, like basically if you see something, you should let us know. Like see something, say something. Like if some seed's not germinating well for you, or it's doing weird things, I encourage you to call your seed companies because, well, for one, we may be able to help you troubleshoot what's going on. And two, you might be alerting us to a problem that we didn't know about and could save you and a lot of other people a lot of hassle. Because there are some crops, like for germination specifically, they'll do good in storage. We test them every 6 months, they're germinating well. And then all of a sudden, like the germ rate can just tank. And it varies by variety, it varies by a lot, but stuff like that can happen. And so let us know. We can maybe help or prevent it from happening in the future. So as with most systems on your farm, optimizing your system for what you're trying to do is really important for starting seeds. So for our on-farm seed storage, once you get your seeds, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. Keep them cool, keep them dark, keep them dry. Like in a facility, like if you're storing onions or garlic over the winter, you want it pretty cool, pretty dry. They could work well there. I find that containers don't matter too much. I myself am hesitant to put them into airtight containers just because there is moisture in that seed and condensation. I have had condensation happen before, and moisture on seed before you plant it is never something you want. But yeah, it doesn't have to be too fancy. Just keep those three in mind. But you do have to know the crops you're working with. Like some seeds just don't store that well. Alliums, don't have too long of a shelf life, maybe 2 to 3 years in my experience. Pelleted seed is sometimes, well, it's usually best used the year that you get it. And then the most infamous, of course, parsnips. The number I remember hearing, like every year they're in storage, the germination rate decreases by 50%. So that one's a little needy. You got to produce seed from that every year to have a good, strong, viable seed. But good thing they are so delicious. So yeah, components of your system to think about, like what's your propagation house like? How much sunlight does it get? Can you keep it warm in there? Does it have good ventilation? We'll get more into the specifics down below. And your potting soil components are important too, because seedlings, like they're little babies. They need it just so. You want to make sure your mix it can retain enough moisture to, keep them watered throughout the day, so you're not having to water every couple hours, but you also don't want it to hold on to too much so that they could, just be stagnant and rot. You want to ensure they've got the temperatures that they need to thrive. And, each crop is a little different, needs different temperatures. If you're starting, tomatoes and peppers right now, what they need is a lot different than if you're starting onions and leeks. They all, of course, would benefit from a little bit of heat, but those warm weather crops, the tomatoes and peppers, need more heat more consistently. And not to say that they wouldn't grow in less than optimal conditions, but a non-stressed plant is just going to produce better for you in the long term. Airflow is really important too, I have found, especially out here on the West Coast where it is infamously damp. All of your other factors could be perfect, but if there's no airflow, You can see a lot of damping off diseases and death from your transplants that way. Water, of course, big part of growing anything. You want to pay attention to the frequency of your watering so that your plants don't dry out. And then also like pay attention to the water temperature too. Yeah, like in the middle of summer when you're seeding stuff in June, the water sits in your hose for a few hours. It could be really hot, like too hot for plants, could really stress them out, if not damage them. But then also, like when you're watering stuff now, your water comes straight out of the well, barely above freezing, like that's kind of harsh on a little baby tomato plant too. So I've known folks who like they water their starts out of a big water tank they keep in the greenhouse. So it's at least like ambient air temperature. So they're not stressing out their baby plants too much. And then of course, another thing to think about is your seeding mechanism, like how you're seeding these. You're doing it by hand, you have a little like pinpoint seeder, maybe a vacuum seeder in your greenhouse or a paper pot. Or then for direct seeding, like out in the field, using the Jang and Earthway, like what instrument are you using and what are the different factors, and dialing that in to get them to work properly. And so I wanted to start with carrots, one, because we get a lot of inquiries about carrots, and two, because like all the factors that are important in getting a seed to germinate well are relevant in carrots, but they just seem to be magnified. Like each factor, like the consequences of something being a little askew can just be amplified. So for carrots, as with a lot of crops, initial weed control is really important. They take a really long time to germinate. Even when they do, they're kind of slow to get going at first. So any competition by a strong weed seed bank is really going to set them back. So a lot of people do stale seed bedding when you prepare a bed, you wait a week or two for seeds to germinate, and then you prepare it again and plant right into that, or you could flame weed it. Flame weeding is when you use a propane torch. In some arrangement, it can either be a single torch, or now they make nice like bed wide flame weeding contraptions to go over a whole bed. So you could either do it right before planting, and or for carrots, the way I had always done it is I prep the bed, I seed the carrots, and especially those first plantings, like they take 2 weeks or longer to emerge. It's a slow go with them. So I would seed them, wait about, I don't know, like 10 to 12 days. And in the meantime, I'd be digging around in the soil to like find the seeds and see how far along they are. And the range I was shooting for was about like 2 to 4 days before they pop out of the soil is when you want to flame, because then they're coming up in a nice fresh bed with no weed competition. Another technique people employ for that is using a silage tarp. You could throw down a silage tarp, get the weeds flushed that way, uncover it, seed into a nice clean bed there. And then you also, want to think about seeding depth. Carrots, it's a pretty small seed. You don't want to plant them too deep. Like, in general, the rule of thumb is plant a seed as deep as it is wide, So like a pea, there may be like, I don't know, almost a ½ inch wide, maybe a little less, but you can plant them like an inch or more. But a carrot, it's small. You don't want to plant them too deep, but you do want them covered. So when you seed them, stand density is something you really want to think about too. Like how many seeds are you putting down per foot or per inch? And with carrot these days, at least for organically produced carrot seed, for a lot of the major varieties that folks are using around North America, the lygus bug has become a really big problem. You may have noticed germination rates on your carrot packets being in the high, mid, even low 70s. That's because there's this bug, lygus bug, of which there's, I think, a handful of species that affect carrots. They land on the seed head while the seed's developing and like suck the juice out of it, but it's not damaged enough that it's easy to separate the bad seed from the good seed. You know, like the size is similar, the weight and density is similar. And so we're ending up with just a lot of non-viable seeds in with the good seed. And so, yeah, you might want to adjust your seeding rate based on that. Like, should you oversow by 10%, 15%? Like if you're trying to have, you know, one germinate per inch, maybe like instead of 2, you throw down 3 seeds per inch. And then, yeah, it also depends on what your seeding strategy is. Like, are you seeding and planning on thinning them? Or are you going a little lean and trying to not thin, which is what I try to do. I love farming, but thinning carrots is like the worst. It's definitely my least favorite thing to do. But you have to think about like if that's worth the risk. You know, if you seed heavy and you plan on thinning, like thinning is a big time spender. But if you seed lean and something goes wrong, you know, to start with, you're waiting 2 weeks to see if they come up at all. And then when they do, if your spacing is like 3 or 4 times as big as you intend, like that's, you know, way fewer carrots you're able to sell. So that really just speaks to getting your seeder dialed in too. Which I'll get back to in a minute here. Yeah, pelleted seed versus raw seed. We've had a hard time. We actually don't have any pelleted seed this year just because the supply of carrot seed was so low because of the lygus bug damage. We didn't want to risk sending some out for pelleting and not having it work out, because that can sometimes happen. But hopefully in future years we'll have some pelleted seed available, and you know, that's a different seed roller or seed plate depending on what you're using. And that the clay formula that is used to make the pellet, like it's really helpful for seeding. It really helps in precision seeding for really tightly spaced things like that. But they are, if they dry out, it can be more of a problem because it gets wet, the seed starts to germinate in there, but if it dries out again, it kind of like hardens into this mass that the seeds can have a hard time cracking back open again. And briefly, just to mention the film coating that you see on some raw carrot seed, usually it's like a silvery coating. That is just for visibility because, you know, carrot seed is basically soil colored. It can be nice to, you know, when you're pushing your seeder down the road, to just be easily able to identify those seeds dropping out of your hopper. So yeah, for seeding rate in your seeder, I've been at this job a couple years and we have some pretty great information about the different seed lots we're selling here, including the seed count per pound. And so since I started here, you know, some carrot seed lots have like 400,000 seeds per pound. This year, some of them have like just over 200,000 seeds per pound. And so they're like twice the size of some other lots. And so we have that information. If you're curious and really want to dial your seeding rates in for each variety, get in touch with us and we can let you know. And then I would think over the years, you could acquire a different set of information for each one. So, you know, like if it's a 200,000 seed per pound carrot, like I'm using, like, let's say on a jank, for example, I'm using this seed wheel or this seed roller and this gearing and this brush setting. But if it's, you know, 400,000 seeds per pound, you would have a different set, and it could really help you like better manage that seeding rate. And then for watering, of course, like carrots are, they really need some consistent moisture. What I had always done, I tried to drip irrigate as much as I could, but for carrots, you just want it like consistently damp until a few days after emergence. So I would overhead irrigate until they were maybe a half inch, an inch tall. And then I put down drip tape, because the drip tape, you know, like they squiggle. Like you can get a direct seeded carrot row to germinate with drip tape, but it seemed harder to manage to make sure the drip tape was lined up just so. Another tool to keep them consistently moist and is actually a weed control method. I've heard of folks using silage tarps in the following way. You seed your carrots, you put the tarp down with the white side up, so it's reflecting the light and heat, but it keeps the moisture in the soil. It keeps the temperature like pretty consistently warmer to promote faster germination. And especially in the heat of the summer when it's, you know, it's a real chore keeping carrot beds wet enough to germinate. You don't have to water them again. And then it's also flushing the weeds. You know, you keep the tarp on there for maybe, you know, 7 to 10 days, pull that up, all the weed seeds have germinated and died. And then the carrots are just ready to come up into a nice clean seed bed. Yeah, so that is carrots. The other one that we get quite a few questions about is lettuce. Mostly folks are having trouble germinating pelleted seed, or there's a really staggered germination like we see in this picture. Like there's some plants that are pretty far along and others that are just starting to pop. Some of that could be thermodormancy. Like lettuce doesn't like to germinate in temperatures above 80 degrees typically. And so like my program, I was seeding lettuce every week throughout the year, but come about mid-May, I'd move the lettuce transplants outside. Like we'd get them seeded, instead of leaving them in the greenhouse, we'd put them on a table outside because it just got too hot in the greenhouse. Come, you know, late June, early July, we would put either some row cover over them or just like put them under a tent to keep the sun off them too, because they just don't germinate when it gets too hot. And you know, they need a little bit of light as well, supposedly, so you don't want to plant your lettuce too deep because they need just a slight amount of light. Wake up. So yeah, the thing that we're going for, you know, is for them to all germinate at once, so they're the same size when you need to transplant them 4 or 5 weeks later. And challenges to that seems to be like uneven watering, either in like an uneven application or an uneven rate of evapotranspiration. You know, like if you're using those black plastic trays, the cells along the periphery of the tray, they just dry out faster because they're like on the exterior, they're exposed to more sun, more wind, they just dry out faster. Another problem folks have seems to be seed dislocation, like seeds just jumping around, which gets to, you know, the water issue down below. Like you want to water those seeds, like anything that's a fine seed, like lettuce, dill, you know, parsley, anything that is easily movable by, you know, like pretty strong stream of water. You just want to make sure it's a gentle rain, because sometimes the water can knock the seed around and cause it not to germinate. We're learning a lot about the pelleting material too that some of the pelleted lettuces are coated with. There's a couple different formulas that folks use. One of them melts, the other cracks. So the melter gets wet, and then the material just kind of sloughs off as water percolates through the soil. And the other formula is when they crack, where like the pellet absorbs moisture and the seed starts to germinate and it just pops open in half. And it seems like the cracking ones are better able. We have the fewer problems with those because the melters, like if they start to melt, if they dry out, again, it like rehardens into this mass that the seeds have a hard time popping out of. And again, the germination rate for pelleted stuff, because it essentially pelleting the seed kind of primes the seed, so it's really ready to go. And if you don't plant it in a year or so after that, the germination rate can be affected, though not always. And then lastly, just the moisture and the location. Yeah, again, like what's on the end of your hose? What kind of nozzle are you watering things with? It can take a long time to get the appropriate amount of water to a plant if it's just this fine spray, but it might be worth it if you're not knocking your seeds around. And then also your frequency between watering, you know, you want to make sure, especially for that pelleted seed, like you don't ever want that to dry out, because even with the cracking pellets, if it hits it at the right or the wrong time, like it could reharden into a pellet that can't really make its way out of there. And then also just thinking about like, where are your greenhouse flats? Where is the location of your stuff? Like, is it way out of the way? where you like have to remember to go do it, or in my case, it's nicer to have your greenhouse operation in a place that you're walking by frequently, so you're like, oh yeah, those look dry as I'm on my way to do this other thing. And then another thing to think about is the cell size of your trays. Those small, like the 120H cell trays, those dry out a lot faster than your 72s or your 50s. So just be thinking about those things as you are setting up for the season. So that's all I've got for now, but we are around for another 20 minutes or so to answer some questions. So let's get into that, shall we?
Yeah, Erin, I'm happy to ask the questions and see between you and Rebecca and Dwayne, who might best be able to address the question and probably help support that as well. But one of the questions I did want to get to, and I know you talked about it a little bit, was Vern's question that was asked right at the start. So it's, I'm dealing with field crops, but the seed problems are the same or similar to field and vegetable. To help others avoid similar problems, last year our seed dealer supplied prudent soybeans and they were a total failure. This seed passed a germination test, but turns out the germination test was 2 years old. Read the lot information. And so, sorry, the question is, would a vigor test have indicated that the seed was slow at germinating or had no vigor?
I can probably answer that since I worked with the soybean breeder at Guelph. It's now fairly standard, in fact, for commercial soybean seed to be vigor tested. And it took them a while to work out how to appropriately test for vigor. But I think now they're germinating them at 10 degrees Celsius rather than at 20 or 25. And there is a big difference in some lots between germination and germination under cold temperatures. Some varieties are much better at it than others, and the conditions that the seed was harvested in can make a big impact as well, and the conditions that it's planted into. Planting soybeans into cold soil is just problematic no matter what. Even if they do have good vigor, they're probably not going to emerge uniformly, and some may not emerge at all. So cold soils and soybeans are very problematic. Vigor testing is becoming fairly common, and a farmer can do their own vigor test. Pick out a handful of soybeans, put them into a small plate or something covered and put it in the refrigerator and see what happens. And especially if you've got 2 or 3 different lots of soybeans, some may show much better vigor than others. The ones that have the best vigor, plant them first because they can handle cooler soil. The ones with lower vigor, wait till the soil warms up a bit more and they might be just fine. So soybeans are a tough one.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that, because we get a lot of questions about, like, is this year's seed or last year's seed? And yeah, the age of the seed doesn't indicate whether or not it's going to germinate well or have vigor. It's really, yeah, about the conditions it's produced in and the conditions it's stored in. So, a seed lot, like a kale seed lot from 4 years ago, could still have a higher germination rate and better vigor than a lot that was produced this previous year, just because of, the health of the crop while it was in the field and potentially storage conditions. So yeah, I understand why people, like, you want the fresh stuff, you want the good stuff, but it doesn't translate as better quality. But it's a really good, it's a good thing to think about. And yeah, you can get some insight from thinking about that.
Great, thank you. Lynn asks, as a home gardener, how can I test my peanut seeds? Or I guess, how can home gardeners test their seeds generally? I'm not sure if you know exactly what they mean by test, or if Lynn, you want to come in and clarify, but. I'm just going to check.
I don't know, is the question where to get peanuts or how to test them? In Ontario, you can get peanuts. There are some commercial peanut producers near Victoria. The University of Guelph did have a peanut breeding program at one time. and developed some very nice varieties of early, very nice red skin Spanish and Valencia peanuts. And when they're grown locally and fresh, they're really good. Pickard Seeds, I think, has picked up that game, and they may have peanut seed available. I think basically grow them like you would grow beans. They're quite closely related to peas, but they don't like to go into quite such cold temperatures, soil. They are generally not, they're a short vine is what they are, but they grow kind of like a row crop. And again, hilling them actually does pay off. You can do that in your garden because the flowers actually produce a peg which burrows back into the soil to produce the peanut. So it needs a really soft soil to burrow into. Peanuts would be great, but they would be a challenge in Ontario or anywhere else, especially other parts of Canada, like Northern Saskatchewan. They would be a real difficult job.
Thank you. I see John says, I've grown Pickard's raw peanuts successfully on Peel Island. Ready to take on the challenge there. Did you wanna? Okay.
I'll go ahead.
Just giggling. The next question is from Lori, and it's a really great question. How do organic certification bodies handle seeds from exchange programs or seed banks? And we were kind of talking in the back channels here. We weren't quite sure the answer to this question. I'm not sure, Dwayne or Aaron, if you know, or if anyone else here knows the answer to this question.
I believe the Canadian and US standards are pretty similar in a lot of ways. And I can, from confidence, only speak about the US organic system, but my understanding is if it's not commercially available and you have good reason to want to try it, like they're not gonna be too upset about that. You know, if you're trying to bring something into your farm that will benefit you in a way that you need and it's just not available organically, I think it's, in my experience, it's pretty easy, but you know, it depends on your certifying agency and your agent. But
I think as long as it doesn't violate any of the organic standards like seed treatment and so on.
Yeah,
Seed treatment.
I can see Carolyn from OCO added in the chat. It has to be untreated. So that's definitely.
Yeah. So as long as it's untreated, it can go into and you can't find it otherwise organically. I think this is a big issue and why we're so happy that there's so many organic seed growers, you know, growing good seed, is that we're getting more and more availability of seed and people are actually planting that in the ground. I wanted to say also, if you plant it into your organic system and save seed from it, then that seed is now organic seed. So that's also a great reason to save the seed.
So we've had a lot of questions coming in, but Dwayne has been pretty good at answering a lot of the potato questions here in the Q&A box. I'm not sure if anyone has any other questions, if you'd like to raise your hand and ask a question live, or maybe if we missed one in the chat. I see someone said, thank you, Aaron, for reminding about not sorting apples and onions with potatoes. I just reorganized my cold room. That
was Dwayne, but yeah, that's good stuff.
Oh, Dwayne, sorry, Dwayne.
Was a great, great reminder. And there was also a question in the chat, Dwayne, about your overwintering peas, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about that because I think it's really cool.
Sorry, about what, Rebecca?
Your overwintering pea project.
Well, they're out there. What we did is we wanted to produce a garden pea that had the ability to overwinter and therefore would produce a much earlier crop and potentially a much higher yielding crop compared to a normal spring planted pea. So I rounded up some seed of winter peas from several programs, one in Montana, one in North Dakota, Oregon, and Washington, and they had been tested in Alberta. And so we had a pretty good idea of which ones were the most hardy. Got a couple of those in and crossed them with a number of different varieties of garden pea. some of the best ones we could get. Grew the F1s in the spring, and then planted the F2 seed, the segregating seed, out in the fall. And had about 15 or 20 plants come through out of several hundred planted. The rabbits got several of them until I put up a rabbit-proof fence, which is just a rumor. Some of them made it to full seed, and I discovered that chipmunks love pea seed, and they can crawl right over or right under a rabbit-proof fence. So I actually lost most of the crop to chipmunks about 2 days before I was ready to harvest them. We did get some, and I had some remnant seed. So it's not going as fast as it should, but this past year I had about 100 plants survive the winter. A lot of them have the characteristics of the winter pea, which is a starchy pea rather than a sweet pea, is a colored flower, which results in anthocyanins in the pod and other parts of the plant, so they have a bitterness. So we're sorting out all of the different quality factors now to try to get a winter hardy pea that tastes good. It's being narrowed down. There are still some candidates in the running, but it's a long-term project rather than a 1 or 2 year project. Still working on it. The other question is, how much hardiness do you need? Fortunately, with global warming, we probably don't need as much as we would have 10 or 15 years ago. So I think we can succeed in producing a garden pea that tastes good, is productive, and has winter hardiness. So you'll plant it in the fall. It will actually start to fix nitrogen. It will provide a cover crop over winter, and it will be fixing nitrogen in the spring as well. So there are lots of benefits if we can get it all together. So thanks to EFAO for, first of all, stimulating the project and for helping fund the first couple of years of it. It's kind of fun. And it's nice when somebody plays you to play in your own backyard.
Well, we do have a couple. Oh, I see a question came in. Is winter pea self-pollinated or cross-pollinated?
Almost all peas are self-pollinated, winter, spring, or otherwise. They have the ability to cross-pollinate, but pollination actually occurs before the flower opens up. So our ancestors selected them so heavily for self-pollinating because you got more seed per pod and more reliable crop that they've almost lost the ability to cross-pollinate. Now, because of that, it makes them more difficult to cross. You have to go into really tiny flowers to pull the anthers out to prevent self-pollination. So they're really good at what they do. And it's really hard to kind of prevent that in order for us to manipulate it the way we want. But peas and beans, you can pretty well count on 99% self-pollination.
Thank you. I'm not sure if any of the speakers have any last remarks they'd like to make before we sign off here. Any programs you'd like to point to? I know you've pointed to us to many, Rebecca. I'll be doing closing announcements, but just wanted to give you a final minute because we have some time.
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
Dwayne, on the potatoes, so I've always just, like, I plant them whenever I get to them when I'm able. Sometimes they're sprouting, sometimes they're not. Do you know, like, is there a documented yield difference between just throwing them in the ground whenever versus this like very well thought out process you outlined?
I can't cite exactly where the information is, but it has been shown many times that green sprouting can give you a real big yield boost, partly because they emerge so fast, like they're ready to go. They get going, they establish a good root system, they establish good foliage cover right away. And there's a tremendous advantage to green sprouting. Planting a potato that's been white sprouted, and the sprouts are 2 feet long, by the time you get it in the ground, first of all, it's really hard to plant. And just to handle them, pull them apart, if nothing else, and get single potatoes planted. If those sprouts are exposed to the air, they desiccate and dry down, or dry up, however you want to put it. If you put them underground and cover them lightly with soil, they can produce foliage from those sprouts. You can get more plant material, if you will, from those sprouts, but they're a lot slower to get going because it's a real shock for them. They're very fragile, and they often break off in the process of planting them. And so you wind up with all of these loose sprouts hanging around, and potatoes that, in my case, hang up in the planter. So planting a properly sprouted or unsprouted potato tends to be the way to go if you can. A badly sprouted potato is going to have problems. And I know the work has been done, but I can't really tell you where it's documented.
Yeah, but worth a try. It's not going to hurt.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you plant what you have.
Yeah, cool.
You know, that's just the way it is. And I've laid out my wish list for how to plant them, harvest them, store them, and everything. It almost never goes according to plan. We sometimes have to harvest when it's wet because it's going to get wetter or snowier. And you can't really harvest potatoes out of frozen ground. So sometimes you have to get them out just before it snows or freezes, regardless of their stage of maturity. So you, as a farmer, you do what you can when you can, and you just hope for the best. Maybe next year.
There's always next year, right?
Yeah, but when you start talking about next year in June, you know it's not going to be a good year.
Tough one, yeah.
Okay, with that, I would like to thank you all, everyone who attended this session and spent your Saturday with us learning about seeds. And a big thank you to speakers, Erin, Dwayne, and Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us, and our sponsors who help us put on these sessions. We hope that the session attendees will take the time to provide us with some feedback on this session, as well as the overall conference. This information really helps us improve your experience at the Guelph Organic Conference. So it's very helpful, and we appreciate you taking the time. And then lastly, we have our final session this afternoon. It's our Regenerative Organic Certification and Organic 3.0 panel discussion. And that starts at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time today. And we hope that you can all make that session as well. And this session and all the Guelph Organic sessions recordings will be made available shortly after the conference ends. So thank you. Thank you. And I'll leave the session open for a little bit so people can go through and get those links that were shared supporting the session.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Yes, thanks everyone.
It's been fun. Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. And yeah, I would love to hear from you. My contact information has been dropped in the chat, so contact me if you have ways you'd like to get involved in seeds.
Okay, for those of you still on, I'm going to end the session now. I hope you've got your links, and if there's anything you'd like us to follow up about, please contact us and we can at OCO and we can send you that information. Have a good weekend, and hopefully we'll see you at the next session.